Hello, my name is Mike Wilkins, and on behalf of Imperial College Business School Centre for Climate Finance and Investment, welcome to this, the second of our three-part series on climate finance. And today I'm very pleased to welcome you to a webinar which is being presented by my colleague, Professor Patrick Bolton. And the topic today is Achieving Net Zero, Crossing Views from Academia, Index and Active Investing. And of course, like last time, we're very appreciative of the support for this webinar by asset manager Unigestion. So just by word of introduction, Professor Patrick Bolton will today lead the webinar focusing on his research, which outlines a simple and robust methodology to align portfolios with science-based carbon budget consistent with maintaining temperatures at 1.5 degrees with around an 83% probability. Among other things, the research shows how to keep the tracking error at a negligible level and demonstrates how it works for both private and passive active managers. It also establishes an exit roadmap for carbon-intensive corporates, thereby generating a form of competition to decarbonize within each sector. It highlights 4 sources of risks: uncertainty around a rapidly shrinking carbon budget, time impacts on decarbonization rates, and implementation risk due to market-wide selling pressure, and uncertainty about taxes on polluting companies. After Patrick gives his presentation, we have our invited guest respondents today. We have Duhra, Head of ESG Indices at S&P Dow Jones Indices, and Sara, Head of Responsible Investment at Unigestion, who will also add their views in response following Patrick's presentation. But before handing over to Patrick, I would like to invite Jérôme Télécher, Managing Director and Head of Cross Asset Solutions at Unigestion, to say a few introductory words. So over to you, Jérôme.
Yeah. Can't see the slide on the screen, Mike. So thank you for the invitation today. So Unigestion is an independent specialist asset management company, so providing a tailor-made solution for investors worldwide. So it's a bit of a summary of what we do. You see that ESG integration is a very important dimension on what we do. Going on to the next slide, Mike, please. So here are the main pillars of our investment DNA. So ESG integration, as mentioned, but also research is a very important part of that road for us. So we're very pleased to be part of this webinar and also to listen to prominent academics like Patrick Bolton on those dimensions. So notably, our view there is obviously that climate investing is a defining issue of our time. Asset managers tend to have a role to play here, obviously, as I would say, allocator of savings or investor themselves. We have our own, we are as net zero initiative signatories, we have our own roadmap to implement that, but we're more than happy to listen of that different perspective from academics, from index investing, and also active asset management on how to achieve net zero. We definitely are conscious this is also an open field, and we very welcome this webinar. So thank you, Mike, and the Climate Center for organizing this seminar, the webinar, and to have such a great lineup to do this. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jérôme, for your comments. And I'd just like to remind all participants that you can ask questions by putting them into the chat, which I will monitor as moderator for today's webinar. And after our presentation by Patrick, Jazz and Sara, we will come back to the Q&A session and get through as many of your questions as possible. So let's now go to the main order of proceedings, and just like hand over to my colleague sitting next to me here, Patrick, to go through his presentation. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here, and a privilege to be able to give you a synopsis of my research on net zero portfolio alignment. Before I describe the key takeaways from our paper and the methodology, I would like to give you a little bit of context. And really, the context is two things I want to mention. The first, which is also related to some other research I've done, is that there's now increasingly evidence suggesting that companies with higher carbon emissions, other things equal, will have lower price earnings ratios. There's a price earnings discount. And here there's a simple calculation. You can see if a company is able to achieve a 10% decrease in its emissions, that will be reflected in a higher price earning ratio. Small amount, but still significant. And the same research describes how this price earnings discount varies across sectors. It's of course very high in the energy sector, but surprisingly, it's also high in a sector like healthcare in the US. The other piece of context, which I think is important, is that when you look at the carbon footprint of institutional investors today, how it's evolved over the last 10 or 15 years, whether you look at scope 1 emissions, scope 2 or scope 3, you see that the average carbon footprint, and here I'm directing you to just one chart, the one for all countries, you see it's basically flat for all three categories of emissions, with a slight decrease in the last 2 years. That was partly driven, of course, by the COVID event. So bottom line, capital markets are pricing in a discount for companies with high carbon emissions. But when we look at portfolios of institutional investors, we don't see any efforts yet to try and reduce their exposure to carbon emissions. Which then raises the question of net zero portfolio alignments, which is the topic of my paper. And Mike pointed out earlier that it's what we're analyzing is relevant both for active and private investors, but it's easiest to understand what we're doing from the perspective of passive index-based investor. And really, we're trying to answer a question that is now being discussed in various circles. You have the UN convened Asset Owners Net Zero Alliance that is discussing strategies to be net zero aligned. And you have the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which has stated commitments to achieving net zero and also interim objectives, but without any clearly spelled out or precisely spelled out methodology. So our paper, which is a joint work with Martin Katpersik, my colleague here at Imperial College, and Frederick Samama, who has now joined S&P. Our paper is really trying to outline a methodology to answer the question, how do you construct a passive portfolio so that it is a net zero aligned? And our perspective is that of a well-diversified investor. We're looking at an investor who likes a market index because it's a well-diversified portfolio. And of course, if you are adjusting the portfolio, you have to worry about how does that affect diversification, and that's captured by the tracking error of the portfolio adjustments, adjusted portfolio relative to a market index. And so how do we think about a net zero portfolio alignment in 2 words? We are starting from a carbon budget that the world has with the objective of remaining within a 1.5 degree warming scenario with 83% probability. And the IPCC tells us that that budget is about 300 gigaton of CO2 as of 2020. Now, of course, we have continued to emit in the meantime. And so now, as of 2021, the remaining carbon budget is approximately 268 gigaton of CO2. So we are saying this budget is all we have, and there's a fraction of that global budget is reflected in the portfolio, and that fraction has to shrink at the same rate as the planet's shrinking carbon budget. And how we measure the portfolio footprint, carbon portfolio footprint, is straightforward. We're taking the constituent companies in an index, and their weights, and we apply those weights to the emissions of the constituent companies. And our lead scenario is one where we are looking at a one-time reduction of the carbon footprint of the portfolio of 25%, followed by a constant geometric reduction of 8% per year until 2050. That's our baseline scenario. And our thinking is that if all companies in the constituent index were to reduce their carbon emissions at that rate, then you wouldn't have to do anything. You just hold the index. But if companies are slower at decarbonizing, then at some point the portfolio has to be adjusted. And when you make a portfolio adjustment, we are seeking, as I said earlier, to minimize tracking error. And what that means is that we want to maintain sector allocation of the original index with only plus or minus 2% adjustments in the sector weights. We calculate the tracking error of the adjusted portfolio using a standard model. And what I am showing you here is the tracking error with respect to the MSCI Europe index. And another baseline assumption we make, this is really just for purposes of analysis, not that we believe this is a valid assumption in practice, is we're taking the underlying emissions of constituent companies in the index to remain constant. That's our working assumption. Of course, that may be wrong, and we may see reductions over time. Currently, we actually see increases rather than constant emissions. And so then we take that as a working scenario, and we adjust the carbon footprint of the portfolio, as I told you, minus 25% initially, followed by 8% per year. And that is done by lowering either the weight of the companies in the constituent companies in the index that have high emissions, or by removing those companies from the index. And we are able to show that if you follow such a strategy for a large portfolio, over 1 trillion euros, you are nevertheless able, despite our strong assumption of constant emissions for constituent companies, we're able to show that you can maintain low tracking error, 0.08% in 2021, and the peak rising to 1.9% in 2050. And we replicate those results for the MSCI World and the MSCI Emerging Market Benchmark, and we get very similar results. So the bottom line is, if you are trying to be net zero aligned, here's a particular strategy you can follow, and you can maintain a product that is really what clients, certainly index-based investors, want, which is a exposure to well-diversified market risk. Now, there are other methodologies you could use. Here I want to point to two other papers we came across that are looking at the similar question. One is by a recent paper by WWF, which looks at net zero aligned portfolios, where they are prepared to make slightly less strict assumptions, in particular in terms of the tracking error. And there is another study by a team at the BIS that reaches very similar conclusion to ours, follows a similar strategy, but does not actually try to minimize tracking error of the decarbonized portfolio. So there are approaches one can follow. I think that's the main takeaway of our paper. And circling back to what the context I mentioned initially, if you understand that currently carbon footprints of portfolios, institutional investor portfolios, is very high, far from net zero, and if you understand that markets are beginning to penalize companies with high emissions, you can see that from a risk management perspective, it does make sense to try and propose portfolios, market-based portfolios that are slowly decarbonizing, so as to reduce this risk exposure to carbon transition risk for investors. That's pretty much what I have to say.
Thank you, Patrick. That's well within your allotted time, so I appreciate that. So thanks to Patrick for that. I think that gives us a great sort of basis for hearing from some of our guest respondents. So please think about your questions as you hear about the respondents coming in with their views, and put them into the chat, and we'll come back to that afterwards. But maybe, first of all, let me just turn to our first respondent this afternoon, and that's Jaz Duhra. So Jaz is head of ESG, global head of ESG indices at S&P Dow Jones Indices, and I'll just turn it over to Jaz now.
Thanks very much, Mike. Hi, everyone, and thank you as well to Patrick for that very interesting overview. So I'm going to spend 7 minutes or so just giving a quick overview of the approach that we've taken at Dow Jones Indices to create our net zero index methodology. So the reason we've decided to create our net zero strategies is because we know that as a world, as a society, we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We've seen very significant commitments being made by the financial community to hit net zero by 2050. We offer solutions to passive investors. Those passive investors are looking for transparent net zero methodologies to enable them to meet those commitments. So at S&P, we've created 2 sets of indices. One's called Paris aligned benchmarks. The others are called climate transition benchmarks. Together, we call those our pact indices, which we launched in 2020. If I can take the next slide, please, Mike. The foundation of our approach is the EU benchmark regulation. So the EU have stipulated minimum requirements for benchmarks that want to use the label of either being Paris aligned or climate transition aligned. Very broadly speaking, the climate transition benchmarks are more lenient of the two. They offer a bit more diversity. The Paris aligned benchmarks are a little bit more restrictive. I'm not going to work through all the different requirements, but I would like to point out a key difference and a key similarity that really drives these 2 different labels. The difference being is that the stricter of the 2 benchmarks, the Paris-aligned benchmarks, require the exclusion of companies involved in fossil fuel activity. So from the outset, you're limiting your universe. The most important shared feature, both benchmarks, is that requirement to decarbonize at a rate of 7% year on year. So this is irrespective of what the parent index is doing in terms of carbonization or decarbonization. That rate of 7%, this is the rate of decarbonization that the IPCC has set out if we want to hit net zero emissions by 2050 and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. There is also one other similarity between the 2 benchmarks that is worth pointing out, and that is exposure constraints. So we can't achieve the decarbonization in our indices by simply tipping the weight into low impact sectors. We have to maintain the same exposure to high impact sectors. S&P, we've done this in quite a unique way. So we're not just classifying companies as being either high or low impact for climate change. We're making this classification at the revenue level. So we know that companies often will have multiple different revenue lines. Those will have different impacts on climate. So we're making sure that we match the index level revenues in our net zero indices to make sure that they match the high level impact revenues of the parent index as well. To the next slide, please, Mike. So our solutions is a very busy slide. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'm just going to point out a few key highlights from here. So our offering, we do meet all the minimum EU requirements, as I've just shown in the previous screen. We also go above the EU requirements. The reason is we wanted to align with some important frameworks, so particularly the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This is a very widely adopted framework globally. It provides a nice holistic view of how companies are managing both their transition and physical risks, as well as the opportunities of climate change. Now, the transition risks of climate change, these are the risks that we're going to see companies more exposed to. If we are able to limit warming, we're going to see that if we do hit 1.5 degrees, there will have been some major shifts in the way that we operate as a society, to the economy. This will have a financial impact on companies. So for instance, carbon prices are likely to rise. We wanted to consider the transition risks within our indices. We also know that if warming continues, and we already see evidence today of the physical risks of climate change, so hurricanes, floods, this does have a financial impact on companies too. We wanted to consider both transition and physical risk, particularly because these two risks are not connected. So you can be a company that is very well positioned to transition, you can be 1.5 degree aligned, you can still be exposed to the physical risks of climate change. And also we don't know what climate scenario we're going to be facing in the future. So as much as we hope that we are going to be in a 1.5 degree aligned world, if we do end up exceeding that level of warming, we want to ensure that we're aware of the risks, of the physical risks of companies within our particular indices. Now, in terms of the climate data sets that we're using in our indices, we're using Trucost data sets. So Trucost are market leaders when it comes to the provision of climate metrics. They've been part of S&P Global now for several years, and they provide us with really detailed company-specific research that drives the weighting of companies in our index. So there's a couple of data sets I'd like to point out. So one is the physical risk data set that I mentioned. So this is based on matching over 2 million physical assets back to companies. So at the company level, we're able to understand exactly where the geographical exposure is of a company. On top of those company-specific maps, we're then able to put on hazard maps. So these are 7 different types of physical hazards that we're looking at. So water stress, flood, heat wave. We're then conducting a sensitivity analysis. So based on each location and each type of asset it might be. So for instance, a nuclear power plant is going to be more exposed to, say, drought as a risk compared to an office block. So we have very nuanced data when we're looking at the physical risks of climate change. What we're able to do with that data is dynamically cap the weight of individual companies in the index, and we're also able to ensure the index as a whole has lower exposure to physical risks of climate change. Another interesting data set I wanted to mention here, and an approach that we take in our indices, is how we're looking at how we decarbonize the index. So we know we have to decarbonize at both an absolute and a relative level. Of course, the easiest way to do that is to look at a company, look at its current carbon footprint, which includes scope 1, 2, and 3, and tip the weight to more carbon efficient companies within its particular industry group or sector. We do this, but this tells you nothing about how a company is likely to perform in the future. So we're also using company-specific forward-looking transition pathway data. So what we're able to do is identify which companies are on a path of being 1.5 degree aligned looking forward. The way we do this is we use models based on science. Every company is allocated its fair share of emissions to be 1.5 degree aligned in the future. These models are based on recommendations by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So for instance, one of the models used is a sectoral decarbonisation approach, which recognises that the ease of decarbonisation is going to vary sector by sector. So each sector has allocated its own decarbonisation pathway to align with 1.5 degrees. On top of this, we have predicted pathways of emissions for all companies based on, for instance, their own disclosed science-based targets, where we see that a company is on a pathway of being well transitioned, of being under its 1.5 degree aligned budget, we can potentially overweight that company in our index. So the headlines of how we're then creating our indices: we apply baseline exclusions, we then optimize the index, we use a simple transparent framework. The objective function here is simply to minimize deviations from the parent index, which includes sector and country deviations, whilst we're meeting multiple climate and investment objectives. I'll take the final slide here, Mike, just to summarize. What we end up then with our indices are indices that are 1.5 degree aligned. They meet key regulations such as the EU benchmark regulation and the TCFD framework, and the end result are broad and diverse indices that are designed to closely track the benchmark.
Thank you very much, Jazz, for that great outline of what you're doing at S&P Dow Jones Indices on this area. Maybe now I can just turn to Sara Razmpa, who's Head of Responsible Investment at Unigestion, to give her response on this topic. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you, Mike. If you go to the first slide, the way that we approach this as active managers, it's a little bit different. For us, at the very beginning, we try to understand basically what's out there. And let's say looking at indices, which is the main point of passive investment. And for us, actually, they act as a benchmark, which we try to actually explain what these indices are. So for indices for our combination of a set of rules, considering liquidity, what sort of markets can go in the investment, and so on and so forth, that are applied on certain categories. So they can be applied on a global universe, on certain sectors or certain activities. And then they require clear quantified measures to construct, as Jazz was showing us beforehand. Now, the topic we are trying to address here, net zero or climate transition, we see it as a topic that goes well beyond the quantified measures that today we have at hand. It starts with a commitment, which is currently, if you look across global indices, many different index providers have the global indices, and majority of the companies that we are holding in those indices have made a net zero commitment. Now, whether or not that materialized currently into action, and these companies are actually going forward and doing things within their, let's say, day-to-day production, it's yet another story. Because for now, at the beginning, we just know that everyone is committing to net zero. Now, for us, net zero, the way that we see it is very company specific. You cannot just form a view about net zero around the specific sectors, for example. The reason is that basically net zero goes beyond what we know as only GHG reduction. You have to consider the energy efficiency. You have to consider the fact that you have to reallocate this budget of GHG that is allowed year on year to companies that really, really need to actually basically run businesses and provide us with solutions that we need for the rest of the economy to decarbonize. You also have to consider that similar activities can have very differing impact with respect to this GHG, for example. As Jazz was mentioning, there is the element of physical risk that it actually controls. It varies by activity, but it also varies by region. So you can have similar activities in different regions, and the physical risk can be completely different for them. One has to do much more, the other one not as much. Then there's the emission reduction goal, the temperature alignment to 1.5 degrees. And here the responsibility of different sectors varies. And that's why it's kind of tough to address this quite passively, because some companies need to just a little bit reduce their GHG, and they will be aligned to this 1.5 degree trajectory that we have on a forward-looking basis. Some has to do much more. If you're looking at the energy sector, some of them, they just need to change their business model significantly. Finally, you have a lot of large companies in global, let's say, indices that have different revenue streams, sometimes much more than, let's say, 5-6 revenue streams. Some of them are not at all in, let's say, energy or industrial sectors and so on and so forth, but they may have one of the revenue streams attached to stranded assets. Then they have this risk that they need to control, and they are not even on the similar activity, let's say, sector. If you can move to the next slide, please. Then the passive versus active question comes to us in this way. If you actually consider whether or not companies have committed to this net zero, then it would be kind of easy to consider the commitment of the companies and hold a passive investment with certain tweaks and marginal exclusions and lower tracking error. But if you actually want to take a look at all of the aspects of net zero, which goes beyond the GHG reduction, you have the physical risk, you have the energy efficiency, you have the distribution of the GHG budget among different activities. And most importantly, you have the eventual GHG offset that in these cases we are not considering, because at the end of the day, we will not have zero GHG. Each one of the companies will have some sort of GHG that they need to offset as well. And on top of all of these, you need a proper management of the companies to basically address all of these risks. Now, if we consider a low tracking error and marginal exclusions to keep some sort of passive investments, today you might have to compromise on the integrity of this net zero effort for many of the companies in global indices. You also may see a lot of these indices alter their sector allocation, so increasing kind of the weight or allocation to sectors or activities that are less significantly impacting climate change and this GHG problem that we have as of today, such as healthcare, bank, diverse IT, and so on, and withdrawing the support from the GHG intensive activities, which are an actual problem as of today, and they're responsible for the transition to a low carbon economy. You have to also consider from another point of view as well. We need, let's say, battery producers for our electrical vehicles to reduce the GHG massively in a scope 3. But then the battery producer has a higher GHG budget than many other activities. And if we just blindly go after GHG, we might exclude battery producers, energy companies, and even cement producers from our investment universe, or massively underweight them simply because we are only focused on the GHG and not the GHG distribution. Now, the question comes to mind is that whether or not these sort of investment collectively can help our investors or even us to meet our intermediary goals for 2030 and net zero future for 2050, because this is not just 1, 2, 3 investments. We as a, let's say, society, we as the whole planet have this responsibility to get there. So if we just blindly put aside the high GHG activities, we might not collectively get there. If you can move to the next slide, please. Finally, we believe a net zero future will require a couple of actions and compromises. Going back to the discussion previously, based on EU regulation, if you remember at the very beginning, the discussion started from the GHG reduction in the investments. But then since 2015, it has evolved to pinpoint activities under the EU taxonomy that are more significantly addressing climate change. And climate transition can be basically established through these sorts of activities, not any sort of activity that is out there. These are the kind of activities that have higher impact on the climate change overall. So we believe we have to support these sort of activities that are directly impacting climate transition, find the ones that are moving faster. They might be high GHG businesses, but they might be reducing their GHG way faster than many others in their own sector and activity line. And we need to support these businesses for them to actually help us to get to net zero. Then we need to accept to withdraw support from companies with no precise net zero plans. As I said before, today, majority of the companies are committed to net zero. But when you go and see what are the results of this commitment, who have reduced their GHG, who is doing the business more efficiently, there is not much to find there. And that is going to be the worrying part of our net zero journey. But when you actually go and study these kind of companies in depth, eventually you have to actually decide to exclude them, which results in a higher tracking error. We think currently we still need an active approach to finding the proper net zero investments, as we believe the passive approach will face significant hurdles to achieve this goal as of today, because the movements are much more company specific and they cannot be categorized and just identified by the level of the GHG of the businesses. We think the only solution is looking at these companies within their industry, within the guidelines that are set out there for example, by SBTi or for high GHG sectors by International Energy Agency, and identify with respect to these relevant activities how fast the companies are actually moving. And finding the winners is going to be key for us to have a net zero future. And then following by the engagement as it goes. Finally, we believe also that the tighter regulation will come. These companies will have to be more transparent. They will have to report. We will eventually have proper implemented carbon taxes. And when we have all of this homogeneous future stance and information, then we would be able to form these passive investments. Sorry if I passed the time.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Sara, for that. I think that was a great overview of the active approach to investing in net zero. So I think now, as come the timer, we can go into Q&A, and let me just check and see what we've got in the chat. Nobody yet is asking any questions, so maybe can I just encourage you to put your questions into the chat if you've got any. And I will monitor them and make sure that they get answered by either Patrick, Jazz, or Sara. Maybe while I'm waiting for the first questions to come through, I could maybe just go back to Patrick at first instance. Patrick, you heard from Jazz about what could be done in terms of looking at the passive index-based approach. You heard from Sara about the sort of almost counter arguments in terms of active investing and the benefits of going down that route. What's your opinion? I mean, based on your research, is it active versus passive, or is there room for both?
That's a great question, Mike. So I took a lot away from both Sara's and Jazz's presentation. I think there are a lot of trade-offs, and there is no one size fits all answer. There are a lot of investors who want a passive index and are basically wedded to a passive strategy. And I think what Jazz was outlining and what I was discussing based on our paper is it's targeted at that investor clientele. But there is also a very large clientele that is willing to have more actively, portfolio management, and I think this is what Sara was reflecting, and Sara brought out some key trade-offs. For example, one of the points that I thought was important that she mentioned is that she pointed out, maybe as an active investor, after a few years, if there's no progress in any form of decarbonization in a company, the company is unwilling to make commitments, SBTi commitments, and so on, maybe there comes a time when you want to divest from that company. And when you make that decision, that may come at the cost of higher tracking error. So there's a clear trade-off there between more active engagement and just minimizing risk. I think the tracking error perspective is really primarily about keeping risk low. And I'm thinking of, for example, a very large asset owner like NBIM, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. They are primarily pursuing a passive strategy. For them, it matters a lot whether you're building up a high tracking error or not. So I think what Jazz was describing, what we have analyzed in our papers, may be more suitable for such an investor.
Right. Yeah, I see. Yeah. So it's not one size fits all. Maybe as I'm waiting for questions to come in, I could just go to you, Sara. And I think I have to ask this question because it's so topical at the moment. The head of responsible investment at HSBC, as was currently suspended, mentioned that climate it shouldn't be a worry for investors. I'm just wondering What's your view on that? Should investors be worried about climate change as head of responsible investment at Unigestion?
Well, I mean, we should definitely all be worried about climate change, but I think what we have to take away from different messages from outside is usually that climate change needs to become, and I think it has become already for many, basically a risk that you control like any other market risk. So it should not be something that the investors choose to go in or not go in. It's just going to be any risk like liquidity, factor exposures, and so many other things like valuation that we need to actually control. Because basically, as different companies are committing, and including that all of the financial companies, asset managers, it's kind of our responsibility to control climate risk for our investors.
Thank you. Maybe just a question's just come in on the chat, and maybe this could be a good one for you, Jazz. Question is, are there pending inflection points, a definitive carbon price, for example, that would accelerate a shift to passive climate investing?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I think there has been this anticipation for some time that, maybe a shift is coming. We've been waiting and anticipating for policymakers and regulators to move. How close we are to a carbon price that's really going to move the needle and really going to price in carbon for companies and investors, I suspect we're still going to be waiting a little while for regulators to make that shift. I think the carbon price needs to be much higher than where it is. I think somewhere near $100, where it's nowhere near that at the moment. But we are seeing shifts in regulation. We are seeing shifts in policy globally. From every region. The EU generally tends to be ahead of the game, and it's great to see efforts being made to try to bring transparency to the market, to try to make it easier for the end investor to compare products from one provider to the next. It's still rife with challenges because even with that trying to bring in some kind of consistency. So I was referring earlier to the EU benchmark regulation, where the idea is it would be easier for a user to compare one index to another index. Those indices are still being driven by different data sets, and those different data sets will approach the assessment of a company's carbon footprint, a company's future position in different ways. So even with that drive and that effort to bring transparency to the market, there are still going to be challenges, and ultimately work needs to be done by the end investor to kind of grapple with what the underlying funds, indices are trying to achieve.
Thank you. Maybe a question here could be for you, Sara, actually. Can you name the biggest challenge for investors in sourcing and generating new low carbon investment alternative products? For example, renewable technologies, low carbon materials, sustainable energy providers.
Yeah, basically, if I understand this correctly, I think the challenges as active manager, one of the questions will always be the tracking error, because everyone kind of benchmark any sort of investments, even if it's about renewable technologies versus a market cap level. So you have the tracking error, and then you have very specific challenges that these days we face with these sorts of investments. It's about the supply chain disruptions. So we have the issue from the shipments coming from China. You have the issue of the war in Ukraine and Russia. So there are different kind of macro issues that are impacting, let's say, the performance of such a strategies a little bit more than, let's say, the general practice in the market. But we do believe that these are short-term problems, and because we are, in terms of climate, you're very much looking at the long term. And when you're planning for midterm and long term, these kind of issues that are issues that will pass. And if you kind of invest correctly, that is the purpose of the active managers, probably you will be less exposed to these events than many others.
Thank you. Another question's come in for you, Sara. Could you please elaborate on how you define GHG distribution and how you spot each company on distribution?
So basically, the GHG distribution for us is something that it comes with the activities. In general, when we look to invest alongside climate transition, we are looking only to invest in the activities that are directly impacting climate change, which means that those are the activities that can drive change. Now you have two sorts of such companies. The companies that their main purpose is actually reducing the GHG themselves, which are the high GHG impact sectors like utilities, energy sectors, the battery producers that I was mentioning, which is quite interesting. And then you have the other sorts of companies that are actually aiding the decarbonization of the rest of the economy. So, for example, you can consider hydrogen producers and all of the supply chain of hydrogen, the carbon capture companies, and so on and so forth. So renewable energies and those. So these sort of companies naturally need much less GHG. In terms of the GHG distribution within the market, these sort of activities, as well as the secondary activities such as healthcare, banks as financials, really the financial banks, and diverse IT need the least GHG within the distribution. If GHG is, let's say, at absolute level, let's say at X absolute level, there's a small portion that goes to these sort of activities, and the bigger portion needs to go to the activities like producing cement, airplanes. Currently, you're talking about energy that we will need gas, probably even oil till 2035, 2040, based on the definition that is underway for EU regulation. So those kind of companies will keep polluting, and we need to give the budget in the distribution to those sort of companies. And where we don't need it, we have to reduce it as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you very much. Question here maybe for Patrick. Do you think novel scientific-based GHG emission measurement methodologies could have an impact on capital allocation decisions in the medium term?
I think I can only speculate about this. It's a very good question. I think new technologies are going to make a difference for particular greenhouse gases, such as methane. You can do satellite imaging, and I think that's going to be very powerful in trying to address methane emission reductions in particular sectors like agriculture, for example, which is pretty much left out of currently of any greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts. Yeah. So I'm hoping that would be great if that were to happen. I mean, the fact that the technology exists, that it can be deployed, it doesn't follow from that it will be used in this particular way. But we can hope that it will.
Yeah, maybe Jazz, I could get your viewpoint on that. Are you seeing sort of new technologies and in measuring emissions coming into play in terms of how it's affecting the way that you're looking at this in your indices?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the broad question, and will we see kind of shifts in capital? I think yes, because we already are. We're seeing just the broader trend of more flows going in towards ESG. Within that, you see a mini trend of more assets flowing into net zero strategies. I suspect with all the commitments we're seeing from the financial community, including short-term measurable targets, that we are going to see more capital shift towards companies that are aligning themselves with 1.5 degrees. Of course, if you're a solution company, absolutely, we see trends where we have solution indices where we do see a lot of flows and a lot of investment, because we know that we need the solutions if we've got any hope of achieving 1.5 degrees or net zero by 2050. And that science-based element is really important for us in our approach as well. So all the data, all the research that we use is steeped in science. So whether that be from the IPCC, whether it be from the Science Based Targets Initiative, we're always referring back to important global frameworks where scientists have input into what is required. We want to have credibility behind the methodologies that we use, and we lean very heavily upon the climate scientists we have within S&P Global, which you'll be very familiar with yourself.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there was a mention of stranded assets before. I think it was mentioned by Sara, and we got a question just come in on that. And this is around any interesting financial instruments or financial engineering strategies that can reduce the life of stranded assets.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would not think about it in the terms of financial instruments that can reduce that, because the stranded assets, there are a limited number of stranded assets out there. With respect to climate, we are usually referring to brown energy, and it starts from coal and then oil and gas. And for now, that's all we have on the table. And we cannot kind of reduce their life, rather than we have to put them aside. And that's the decision that has been made very actively with respect to coal, that you see a lot of even passive managers now consider excluding coal from their investments, or actually limiting the company's exposure in terms of their revenue exposure to such companies. Soon enough, there will be directives probably out there for what we can do with oil and gas, because as I mentioned, these are the companies we do need exposure to today, because we need to actually run our businesses. We cannot put all of it aside and then not run anything. But there would be limitations to the exposure we can have to oil, which is the second, let's say, more polluting, and after that gas, which is the cleanest of the three, while we are working on the alternatives to replace them. So, for example, currently for oil and gas, I think the long-term view of how we can replace them is getting a little bit of help from the hydrogen industry, and then the other side of the help from the renewables to replace them to some extent. And this is the way that we're currently seeing that the market is moving towards it slowly, but there are moves in the market.
Thank you. We've still got a minute or so. If anybody wants to tap in a question before we have to close, please go ahead. While you're thinking of your final questions, there's just a quick one here for Patrick. And that's really, what's the title of your research in relation to achieving net zero? And I think it's net zero carbon portfolio alignment, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So the question is? What's
the title of the research related to what you gave your presentation on?
I don't understand the question.
Sorry. The title, just the report's title, the paper's title.
Oh, the paper's title.
Yes.
Net zero portfolio alignment.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was the simplest one we had so far today. And I think we're pretty much out of questions at the moment. Patrick, was there anything else that you wanted to say? I know that you've got some other research coming up.
I just want to comment on something that Sara said, which I think is quite important. About, you know, we have to keep businesses alive that help us decarbonize in other sectors. That's a very important point. Mm-hmm. And it can be inserted into the methodology. And it's really a question of looking both at direct and indirect emissions. So if your direct emissions allow you to substantially reduce indirect emissions, maybe currently or in the future, that is a kind of emissions you want to encourage. So I think that's the point. So you can't just do a simple net zero alignment strategy. That's maybe that's the one line takeaway. You can't have net zero alignment portfolio strategies just based on direct emissions.
Right. So you've got to look forward through to scope 3.
You have to look at scope 3.
Okay. If I can add actually one point to what Patrick is saying, is that I think the correct way that we can collectively look at that, and I agree that we need to still do a lot of research on that, is that not only focusing on the GHG of the company per se, but we have to kind of factor in the GHG saving of the products of the company as well. And that way, if we collectively look at the net, probably we're going to have a better view of the situation.
Mike, I mean, there was also a question on how effective will be having a definitive carbon price useful. I think this is a very important dimension. So what's going to be, what shall be the real price of the carbon as a way to evaluate the impact on companies and the benefit they will get. And I think this is, from a macro dimension, most probably one of the topic we'll have to discuss into the third webinar. So that's an opening to that. It's where we have most probably, we have to be speculative, as mentioned by Patrick, on that dimension. But I think this is a very important dimension to consider as well. So having a better market to evaluate the carbon pricing consistently in different places of the world. So it's going to be very important.
Thank you, Jerome. And Patrick, I believe you've got a paper coming out soon in relation with the IMF. Do you just want to say a word or two about that?
Yeah, the one line takeaway from that paper is you definitely want to phase out coal. So I would reinforce even more what Sara said about coal. Coal is a very costly energy to use at this point.
Right. Good. And I think it's called the carbon arbitrage.
Yeah, great carbon arbitrage. It's a calculation of the benefits of replacing coal with renewable energy, taking into account all the costs of building the renewable energy capacity. Great.
Well, we should look forward to that one coming out anytime now. So I think that basically brings us to the end of the Q&A session. So a big thank you to Patrick, obviously, for presenting, to Jazz, and to Sara from Unigestion for your responses. I think there was some great insight there, both on the views on index or passive investing, as well as the views on the active investing side. I think we can draw our own conclusions. I don't think it's one size fits all. I think there's a mixture of everything that needs to be considered in the terms of adjusting your portfolio alignment for net zero. So with that, I think we're kind of running out of time, and I wanted to draw the webinar to a close. Just to remind you that you can download Patrick's paper, which is called Net Zero Carbon Portfolio Alignment, on the CCFI, the Centre for Climate Finance and Investments website. And the recording of this webinar will also be available shortly after it finishes on the website as well in the next day or so. As Jerome mentioned, the third and final of the summer series of climate finance webinars is due to take place in about a month's time, at the end of June. We will be circulating invitations for registration for that event. The topic will be clean energy investment and strategic asset allocation. And our colleague at the Centre, Millie Fomikov, will be speaking about her research, which she's done in conjunction with the International Energy Agency. So that's coming up in about a month's time. So we look forward to doing that and to welcoming you to that webinar. So please stay tuned to these summer climate finance webinar series from the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College Business School and from our supporters at Unigestion. Thank you very much for listening, and we wish you a good day and a great rest of the week. Bye for now.